Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Dr. M. David Litwan. And if you're watching this, you must have true gnosis. Thank you so much for giving this presentation for those who are helping to fund and keep you doing what you're doing, Dr. Litwa.
Yeah, I really appreciate you for having me on, Derek, and all my patrons. Really, I'm in your debt, and I hope that all of these are very informative. We're coming near the end of the series. This you can take as a kind of generalized course in basic church history, but probably the church history that you're not going to find in the standard textbooks. So this is episode 21, which is on a figure called Theodotus. And Theodotus, although not a household name, is another one of these extremely important early Christian thinkers, which should be on the table for talking about what really happened in the early period. So here's what we know about Theodotus. We know that he comes from Byzantium, which is modern Istanbul, okay? And he comes to Rome in the late 2nd century. Perhaps he was a wartime refugee. We know that the Emperor Severus attacked Byzantium in the early 190s. He was known as a leather worker, okay, which was a lucrative occupation. Now, a lot of people make fun of Theodotus the leather worker, and it's actually funny that people make fun of him because Paul himself had the exact same occupation. That leather worker job, sometimes called a tanner or a cobbler, because ancient shoes were made out of leather, so he can be Theodotus the shoemaker as well. This working with leather is also the material that you use for ancient tents. So this basic skill of leather working is exactly what Paul did some 150 years before Theodotus. So it's a lucrative occupation, and Theodotus apparently made enough money to give himself room to basically do his own study of scripture. And he read the greatest lights of his own time, which was Galen, who was in Rome at the time. Okay, Galen is the most famous doctor of antiquity, but Galen did all this work also on Aristotelian logic because Galen really loved to argue. And the way that you really come on top of in an argument is Aristotelian logic. You know how to reason well, okay? These kinds of courses aren't well offered today in colleges, but they were the substance of ancient education, that is higher education. And so Theodotus was reading this material, and he's the very first person to take this philosophical model of Aristotelian logic and apply it to Christian scriptures, okay? So that's his claim to fame. Now, what's interesting about Theodotus is he's not working alone. He's working with other people. And I'm going to throw a lot of names at you here, but these are all important late 2nd century Christians. One is Theodotus himself. He actually partnered with another Theodotus who is called the Banker, but he also partnered with Asclepiodotes, Hermophilus, and Apollonides. That's a hard one to say even for me. So these guys get together and they perform what might be called the first joint, that is, group text critical team to work on Christian scriptures. And this is an amazing fact because even in their time, they noticed that there were differences in the manuscripts of New Testament texts, that is, gospel texts and Pauline texts. And so they were interested in actually improving the text. Now, in a sense, this is not so radical an idea, because the very first thing that you did with ancient literature like Homer and Euripides was you made sure that your manuscript reading was correct. So you would correct by comparing it with other manuscripts. But this is the first time that we hear of actually Christians doing this with their own literature. And this tells us that by their time, there was, yeah, chaos in the manuscripts. That is, different readings for supposedly the same text. And these guys set out to create a reliable text. First time we ever hear of that. So that's a huge accomplishment.
Wow.
For church organization, this is the time, late 2nd century, where we get the development of what can be viewed as something like the papacy. In other words, by the late 2nd century, the year 189, Bishop Victor becomes a very powerful bishop in Rome, but he is not the only one. And this is really important. One of the ways that we know he's not the only bishop pulling, running the show and pulling the shots is because we know that the Theodoteans had their own bishop. And they had someone, from their point of view, even more important than Bishop Victor, who was leading the Catholics of the time. So Natalius was a confessor, which means that he had been arrested for being a Christian and that he had confessed his Christian identity in court, but for some reason or another, he had been released. Maybe he had done time as working in some kind of gulag in Sardinia. We don't really know. We know that he was a confessor and that he became a bishop. Okay, and he's a paid bishop, and we have this is the very first time where we get to hear exactly how much Natalius was paid, and this tells us that by this time, definitely Christian offices, church offices, are paid positions. Okay, and so we know that for a time, at least, Natalius competed with the incipient Catholic bishops, who are during his time Victor from about 189 to 99. And then Zephyrinus, who is leading the Catholics from about 199 to 217. Okay, and interestingly, I mean, this is a side note, but we also know that there were competing bishops even beyond Natalius. We know that the refutator, or the writer of the Refutation of All Heresies, claimed to be a bishop also in the early 3rd century. So yes, the Catholics are better organized and they are networking like crazy, but they aren't the only people running the show in Rome. So just briefly on theology for Theodotus, this is unfortunately none of his actual work survives. So he's another figure where we have to depend on hostile attacks. And we have to then understand that our sources are biased and only giving us a narrow lens. Okay, so they only tell us what they get offended at. And then we have to do the work of reconstruction of why they thought that. So we are told that Theodotus believed that Jesus was born from a virgin, but that he thought that even though he was born from a virgin, he was still completely and utterly human. Okay. So some people think that, if you're born from a virgin, well, then you have to be divine from birth, but that's not how Theodotus viewed it. He just thought that God started the pregnancy, but it was just regular male sperm that was somehow created in her womb. And then you get Jesus the man. And he remains a man until at least his baptism. So Jesus is very clearly a deified man. And this is exactly how Theodotus would have put it. He is a man who became God in some way. At his baptism, now some disagreed. This position about Jesus becoming divine at his baptism was incredibly common. We saw this in episode 2 with Cerinthus, and you can read about that in Found Christianities. This comes directly from a reading of Mark and John, where Jesus, is the birth story isn't told, and Jesus is divinely anointed by the Spirit at the baptism. Now, some disagreed, and apparently they did so on the basis of Romans 1:3, by saying that Jesus is only fully deified after his resurrection. And this is the passage in Paul where we hear that Jesus became Son of God, that's the Greek, from his resurrection from the dead, or possibly by his resurrection from the dead. It's a little bit of a controversy about how to translate that. So they had a biblical basis for their views, and they claimed that Victor, the Catholic bishop, was totally fine with this position. Okay. and that the only person to oppose them theologically was Zephyrinus. And Zephyrinus takes office in 199. So that's an interesting claim, and it indicates that there was real theological diversity in the late 2nd century, and that in this case, the Catholic bishop was okay with it, until we get, of course, to Zephyrinus. Now, the last interesting thing about the Theodotean Christians is their view of Melchizedek. They put a real emphasis on Melchizedek, which should interest those of you who are, interested in these Jewish exalted figures who also seem to become divine. But for the Theodoteans, they viewed Melchizedek as a heavenly power of special grace. And they don't say this directly, but it's very clear that they're reading the book of Hebrews, okay? And if any of you are familiar with Hebrews, it has a very exalted view of Melchizedek, that he comes onto the scene, he's without father, without mother, without origin. And this kind of language convinced Christians that he was more than a man, that he was actually a heavenly power. He was either a man who became a god, just like Jesus, or he was always a divine being and simply had some kind of appearance on earth. It was said that Melchizedek interceded for heavenly angels and powers, while Christ interceded for earthly people. So they had distinct roles in the divine economy. And that Melchizedek existed before Christ and may have outranked him. If you remember that saying from the Psalm, Psalm 110, that Jesus or Christ is in the order of Melchizedek. So in a sense, Melchizedek has a certain priority over him. But that may just be temporal priority. So it's not necessarily that Melchizedek is a greater ontologically than Christ, but that he was an angel or a God figure who existed before the Christ. And obviously the heresiologists have lots more negative things to say about Melchizedek. The interesting thing about Melchizedek too is that there's a Nag Hammadi text named after Melchizedek, and this makes one wonder whether the Theodoteans had an influence on this text and may have even wrote its original version. We don't know. But you can read lots more about the Theodoteans in the chapter 21 on Infound Christianities. And there, as usual, you can check out my sources. I give recommended reading. I tell you how I figured out that stuff. Okay, it's a scholarly peer-reviewed book. You can go as far as you want with it if this kind of stuff interests you. But for now, I just send my sincere thanks to everybody, and thanks for watching, and thanks to Derek for letting me do this on his show.
Look, Dr. Litwell, I got one question while we're still here.
Absolutely.
For those who are like me that are getting into this, I can tell your book is going to be a fascinating one with lots of little treasures. I like to call them treasures because it opens more questions maybe than answers sometimes, which is the fun part to me. There's something about figuring out, whoa, we don't really know the answer to that question, and neither does the church. So to pretend like they have it, it's better to say we aren't sure. And so that's a better approach to go, especially when you have some weight that you point out in this book, that some of these heretics may not have been what they're painted to be. They may not, most likely they weren't. But my point is, what if they were closer to the truth of something than what the church became? And that's what I think is interesting about your book, or at least, are they just making stuff up? Is everybody wrong by the 2nd century compared to 1st century Christianity? I mean, at least I'd be willing to grant that before I'd say one of them got it right and the other one got it wrong. Maybe they're all running off. So the question, I just had to tell you, that was my little, I had to let that out after what you just said. That was bottled up. I had to say it. You talked about Romans 1:4, and that Jesus is deified in Paul's eyes at his resurrection. In Mark, it's at his baptism. It seems to be a baptism deification. And I wondered, me and Neil were asking this question. I think he asked us a Bart just to get his thoughts. In Revelation, when we see this, he was the lamb who was slain from the foundations of the world. I wondered if this Christology, this deification of this Christology, is late in the game, being it's in the book of Revelation, and it's trying to harp the deification or this implicit idea that, like, before creation, like, he was deified, being the crucified one. Do you think that that's what's implied there?
Well, so
it's a toughie, I know.
There's definitely a move among Christians to beginning in the 2nd century to see the deity of Jesus as eternal, as something eternal. So he moves very distinctly from a deified man to a God who was incarnate. Okay, and you can call that God the Logos, as he is in John, and there you go. That's a way of exalting Jesus even more in the minds of early Christians, definitely. And so, yeah, you could definitely see the author of Revelation is in this trend that I think the line is what, slain before the foundation of the world or something like that.
Right.
That, to me, that could only mean that it was God's plan. But you may take that in a heavier sense, like he pre-existed, and that's fine. But yeah, there's the definite move to see Jesus as pre-existent, and then Christians take this in different ways. So for instance, in the Sethian book of Melchizedek, okay, really interesting stuff, because they say that Melchizedek is actually Jesus, that he's actually the incarnate Jesus who is Melchizedek, and then he appears later. He's incarnate in several different beings, and before he finally is incarnate in Jesus. And actually, this pattern shows up in Islam too, because, you know, it's like you have a series of prophets, and then you have the culmination in Muhammad. This idea of a series of incarnations, Melchizedek, and, you know, other people, other prophets, and then he's finally born in Jesus, and so Melchizedek is Jesus.
Isn't this what the Baha'i do as well? Like, they keep that.
Absolutely, and probably the Druze. Yeah, so this becomes a very common idea for conceptualizing the preexistence of Christ. And then there's that philosophical way, which is more like the logocentric way, that there was always a logos. And, you know, that's a 2nd century idea. You know, I think John, the Gospel of John was written in the late 1st century, but I think the prologue is early 2nd century. So that prologue gets attached later, just as John 21 gets attached as an appendix. So, and then Logos theology takes off with Justin and Tatian, and those guys are also in the book. So, you know, and then Logos theology, it isn't Nicene theology, you know. So, you know, they're coming up with different solutions in this great Wild West kind of a theological universe. You know, it's a jungle. Some say it's a laboratory, but I say it's a jungle because it's just wild.
Oh, if you haven't got the book yet, go get it. I definitely look forward to diving deep and continuing this. This has been fantastic, Dr. Litwood. Thank you for the supporters, obviously, and those who are coming from Myth Vision. Seriously, keep up the good work. But thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Really appreciate it. Yep.
All right.